How many of you have ever watched Jonathan Creek? It used to be on ages ago with, I can't remember his name now. What was he called? But he was in it, yeah, Jonathan Creek. And it was these TV mysteries, and they were being repeated a while ago, but I remember them first time round. But the mystery, it was often a murder, and it resolved around a body or something being found in a locked room with no apparent entry or exit for the person who perpetrated the crime. And then it's up to this guy, Jonathan Creek, to sort of work out who did it. And he's often a bit of a reluctant investigator, but he gets involved. And his day job is working with a magician, dreaming up and testing elaborate acts of mystery and magic. And then it's up to him to resolve the clever trickery that's been done and reveal the perpetrator. Now, I'm not sure why, but the gospel reading reminded me a little bit about that in a very odd sort of way, of a Jonathan Creek mystery in reverse. It's not so much about somebody getting out of the room, but it's about Jesus, a man who's been seen to have died on the cross, getting into and suddenly appearing in that locked room where his faithful yet rather bewildered and somewhat terrified disciples are gathering. Now, we could spend a lot of time thinking about that, and time and energy speculating on the mystery, and people have done over many, many years. But all I want to say on that is that if Jesus has the power to come back to physical life after the crucifixion, and if we believe in that, then we can believe that he can appear in a locked room. We can believe that that's well within his powers. And I think that reminder of these other things just throws into context what Jesus actually has done, the power that he has, and what he has actually done. And what we need to do, we need to trust and to believe. And this must have happened. This locked room appearance must have happened. Otherwise, how else would those disciples actually know and be convinced that he'd come back to life? How would they feel this power within them and this strength coming to them to give them the courage to go on? Because if we think about the various gospel readings that we've got of the resurrection, slightly different viewpoints, none of them actually did believe until they saw him in the flesh. If we look at Mary, she was the first one to actually see Jesus. We had this reading last week. She was the one who saw Jesus but didn't realize it was him until the gardener spoke. The others weren't convinced until later in the day when Jesus appeared to them in that locked room, as we've just heard. If we look at Peter and John, they ran to the tomb after hearing Mary's account. They looked in and they just were bewildered. The body had gone, it had been taken away. The things left very neatly. The linen wrappings, the linen shroud was left where it had fallen. The head covering rolled up neatly on the side. They weren't convinced that anything amazing had happened. They simply thought the body had perhaps been moved by person or persons unknown. Now, Luke, in his gospel, a group of women go to the tomb with Mary, and Luke actually tells us that the male disciples thought that their story of meeting angels and seeing that the body had gone, their story, they thought, the male disciples thought that the women's story was actually nonsense, and they didn't believe it. They dismissed it as idle talk until they actually saw Jesus for themselves. So my question is, after all this rambling around, my question is that if none of the other disciples believed until they actually saw Jesus, why do we call Thomas Doubting Thomas? I think that's a bit unfair that he's singled out with this rather somewhat derogatory name when all the other disciples were thinking the same way until they saw Jesus. But Thomas, when he actually does recognize Jesus, he goes further than any of the others. They just stand around open mouthed, presumably not knowing what to say, or were not told what they say, whereas Thomas calls out, "My Lord and my God." As soon as he realizes it's Jesus, he gives him his full title and his full recognition. My Lord and my God. And still, we call him Doubting Thomas. I think perhaps we should call him, this is a bit of a mouthful, questioning at first, but in the end totally convinced Thomas. Now, I can understand why we call him Doubting Thomas now, because that's a real mouthful, but it gives him it explains a little bit about him. And I think that title, questioning at first, but in the end, totally convinced. I think and I hope and I pray that applies to all of us on our journeys of faith. We may be questioning, we may go through times of questioning at the moment, or we may be totally and absolutely convinced by it. But I trust that we're all somewhere on the journey from questioning to absolute true faith. And really, one doesn't sort of preclude the other. You can have a really strong faith, but still have some questions. Because faith is what it is. It's faith. It's trust. It's not proof. Okay, so faith and questions go together. So let's go back. We're there in the upper room with Jesus and the disciples, and he appeared 8 days after the resurrection, and Thomas was there as well this time. They've been through a lot during Holy Week. They've been through the triumphant entry of the King into the Holy City. We've seen all this increased opposition. They've been to a strange sort of Passover meal with Jesus, where lots of unusual, different things were happening. That led into some prayer, eventual betrayal, Jesus' arrest, torture, his humiliation, and finally, this horrific death on a cross. But now he's back again, just as he said he would be. And he's calling them by name, and he's breathing his spirit upon them. Mark spoke last week on the Zoom service about Mary being called by name. And it's when she was called by name that she recognized Jesus for who he is. And Jesus calls us by name. And it's when we hear him or feel him or get that feeling of being called by name, that is when we come to truly believe. So we know that Thomas understood from his response to seeing Jesus. But what about the others? Well, maybe it took them a few days, even a few weeks, for them to fully understand and to take it all in. And we look towards Pentecost for their final empowerment and their final commissioning for the work that Jesus had given them to do. We don't know how they felt. We're not told how the other disciples felt. Presumably, they felt like Thomas. This is my Lord and my God. Okay, so let's just put that to one side for a moment. And I just want to focus on the last thing that Jesus said to Thomas and the others who were there, of course. What he said was in this reading, "You believe because you have seen me. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me." Now, that really is a message from Jesus to all the countless millions he could see coming down the centuries as true followers of his way. And that includes us, because we are blessed by God, by Jesus, when we come to believe without seeing Jesus in the flesh. Now, Jesus was a great one for stories. He used them for teaching and for getting his message across. And of course, he was part of God's great story, the story that started with creation, that led eventually and inevitably to the salvation story on the cross, and then on into the current era that we are in now, and all the things in between. And the other major part of the story, of course, is humanity. It's people. It's us. We are a major part of God's story. And whether we are aware of it or not, we are part of this story. And we become an active part of the story when we take Jesus into our lives, when we believe and trust in him as the Holy One of God, God's Son. And we are blessed when that happens. Then our stories, then our lives become part of this big story, and then we have a story to tell. Now, the story of Jesus is written down. The story of Jesus and his disciples is written down in the Gospels and in the Acts, and we're all very familiar with those. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the Acts of the Apostles. Now, our stories may not be written down in the same way, but we all have our stories to tell. The stories of our own lives, which include, I'm sure, encounters with Jesus and with the Holy Spirit. Now, these encounters may not be as powerful and as physical as those of the first disciples. We're not going to meet Jesus in the flesh, but they can be just as meaningful and just as empowering. Now, these encounters that we have with God, with Jesus, they may be gentle. They may be sort of gentle and like a flowing stream. It might be just a feeling that we have, or they can be a strong and a powerful feeling, a strong and a powerful message from God to bring us up short, reminding us of the love of God in our lives. And we all have different stories to tell. And we've had the privilege of hearing some of the snippets of people's stories and their testimonies in the Easter Songs of Praise service that's been shared online over the week since last Sunday. And I hope you've actually seen that. And if you haven't seen it, then I can recommend it. Find the link on the website. It's really good. There's some great testimony on there. And there is a lovely little sketch with the children. So have a look at that, and it's good. There are some wonderful stories of how Jesus has moved in people's lives over the years. And when we take Jesus into our lives and truly believe, then we have this encounter with Jesus, and we become part of the story. And that's when we, like Thomas, receive Jesus's blessing, and we are able to respond, "My Lord and my God." Our lives become a gospel story in themselves, if you like, telling of the way that God has been at work with us, inspiring us, comforting us, empowering us, and giving meaning to our time on earth. Jesus said to Thomas, "You believe because you've seen me. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me." And that's us. Now, just to finish, I'd like to share something from a book that I was reading over Lent. I've shared this at another meeting, I think, but it's worth sharing again. And it's a book called Eavesdropping. It's a book of Lent readings, and it's written by Henry Martin, who's an Anglican vicar and writer and an artist. And this is what he says in his final paragraph, actually written for Easter Monday. "This is life, walking and talking with God and trying to make sense of the shared journey. Sometimes God's presence will be obvious. Sometimes God's influence will only become apparent with later reflection. And then at other times, we might realize that God has been close by all along, telling us this story again and again." So let's continue walking and talking with God as we go into